beyond the thunder and lightning, past the clouds, over the dark night. She reached up to the sky of stars and caught the red-hot light of the North Star.
Greetings and welcome back. Thank you all so much for joining as always. President Trump calls the affordability crisis a hoax, but the data tells us a different story. This while it's been reported that employers have cut more than 1.1 million jobs through November, the most since 2020. Folks, people are struggling, really struggling, but don't believe your lying eyes or the deficit in your checkbook. Listen to the lying president. What's really going on? Let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. With each show, my guests and I provide insight and analysis into current events in the broader historical context in which most of these events take place. Let's quickly look at some of today's headlines. First, Rob Reiner's son, Nick, has been arrested on murder charges after his parents' death. That's just horrible, and I pray for the Reiner family. You know, what this brings to mind is whether you're in the spotlight or no light, you can't avoid the challenges and the tragedies of life. A totally different circumstance, but I think it still validates the point. Michael Jackson, for all of his fame, his wealth, his brilliance, etc., he died because all he wanted to do was get a good night's sleep and was forced to extreme measures in search of that sleep. Horrible. Manhunt for Brown University shooter enters third day as person of interest is released. A manhunt continues in the deadly mass shooting at Brown University after a person of interest detained in connection with the attack has been released. Officials now say evidence now points in a different direction. And that's just horrible. I have no idea or insight into the mind of this shooter, but I believe most sociologists and psychologists and psychiatrists would tell you that the violent nature and history of America, both foreign and domestic, is playing itself out right before and manifesting itself right before our very eyes. Also, with a country that is awash in weapons, these are the types of results or outcomes that you get. The chickens are coming home to roost. Contrary to the misguided belief, the Second Amendment does not constitutionally guarantee a right for individuals to keep and bear arms. If you understand the difference between a comma and a semicolon, a dependent and an independent clause, you would understand this. If you don't believe me, look at the sentence structure and punctuation of the First Amendment and compare it to the Second Amendment, and I think you'll see exactly what I mean. Caitlin Johnstone has a great piece entitled, "New York Times Wants the U.S. Military Buildup for War with China, Just as the United States Hits Its First Official $1 trillion Annual Military Budget." The New York Times has published this article, and it's important to realize that it's an editorial. It's not an op-ed, meaning it represents the position of the paper itself rather than solely that of authors. Why? Why a war with China? When was the last time the U.S. won a war or a conflict? Folks, we don't do this well. According to Military Watch magazine, a leaked U.S. war game assessment known as the Overmatch Brief has concluded that the Chinese People's Liberation Army would sink the U.S. Navy's Gerald Ford class supercarriers in a potential conflict over Taiwan. Multiple simulations have shown that Chinese forces would destroy or disable the new carriers in a wide range of ways and could do so before American air power was able to influence the course of hostilities. I think hypersonic weapons play a great role in that outcome. What was President Eisenhower's warning? Quote, "This conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disasters rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." And finally, Dr. King's admonition, quote, "And I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor so long as adventures like Vietnam continue to draw men and skills and money like some demonic destructive suction tube. And you may not know it, my friends, but it is estimated that we spend $500,000 to kill each enemy soldier, while we spend only $53 for each person classified as poor." Folks, when the warrior and the pastor give you the same warning, you need to take heed. On today's episode, the issue before us is the fact that a lot of Americans can't afford bread, eggs, and milk a hoax? What does all of this mean? I believe the tenuous or precarious economic reality is tied to the militarism I just referenced. Let's talk with my guest. He's a professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, where he taught economics from 1973 to 2008. He is currently a visiting professor in the graduate program in international affairs of the New School University in New York City. He founded Democracy at Work in 2012 as a means to promote the idea of moving beyond capitalism through the transformation of the workplace. And his latest book, I believe his latest book, is "The Sickness is the System: When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself." He is Professor Richard Wolff. As always, welcome back.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Leon. It's a pleasure talking with you. Every time I do it, I get a couple of ideas, I write them down, and then I work on writing them up later. So I find this a very fruitful back and forth.
Well, I greatly, greatly appreciate that compliment. Thank you, sir. Let's do this. We've got 30 seconds of video from the president. Let us listen to this whole idea that the plight that Americans find themselves in, the economic catastrophe that they're struggling with, is a hoax. Let's roll that. If we can, please.
Talk more about affordability, but since then has repeatedly dismissed it.
Affordability is a hoax that was started by Democrats.
Yesterday, again blaming Democrats.
Democrats caused the affordability problem, and we're the ones that are fixing it.
At that same appearance, the president getting questioned on another key issue facing his administration.
So the fact that when I go to the grocery store and the orange juice that I used to pay $2.25 for is now $4 a half gallon, and the milk that I used to pay $3.25 a gallon for is now closer to $6. That's a hoax, Professor Wolff?
Yeah, well, it is. It's sort of sad to have to say what I'm going to say, but I think most people, paying attention to this conversation or just thinking about it, they already know. The political party that's in power wants you to believe that the economy is in great shape. And the political party that's out of power wants you to question the economy and maybe, if they can, get you to think of it as a failure and then blame it on whoever's in power. The truth is neither one of those. Our economy is shaped by many forces that politicians have little control over. When things are going well, they like to take a credit, and when things are not going well, they like to blame the other party. It's boring, it's childish, and Mr. Trump practices the same thing so nakedly. Let me remind you, when Biden was president, he was forever saying the economy is terrible. And the minute he becomes president, the economy is in great shape. And it's a pure political ploy on the part of the Democrats to say otherwise. Let me try very briefly to explain. The economy is a little bit like the human body. There are 1,000 ways to measure how well the human body is doing. You know some of them. You do blood tests, you do x-rays, you do questionnaires, you put people on a treadmill, you do all kinds of things to look at all the different parts of our body, the circulation, the bones, the nervous system, all that. And then the doctor comes and sits you down in his office or her office and says, look, these things in your body are doing really well. Keep up what you're doing. This is great. There are a few problems. None of them are all that urgent, but we have to keep a track of your cholesterol level or your weight or whatever it might be. We expect a balanced assessment. If we went to see a doctor and he said, you're fine, everything is wonderful, go home, you'd be smart enough to look for another doctor. And likewise, if he said, oh, you're at death's door, you might as well throw in a towel, also another visit to a different doctor. What we're getting from Mr. Trump is not a balanced assessment of the economy's strengths and weaknesses. We're getting a childish insistence that there's nothing wrong and it's all made up by his political enemies. Here's 2 or 3 examples of, just because they want to get the balance back in. We have a level of debt now in this country. By that I mean the debt of our households, the debt of our enterprises, our businesses, and finally the debt of the government. They are all out of control. They are all immense. They are all much higher than they have ever been in our country. That's a reason for concern. You have to deal with that. You said correctly, we're having $1 trillion defense budget. But this coming year, we're going to have even more than $1 trillion interest payments. That's the government raises taxes on you and me and everybody else and doesn't use the money to help our hospitals or our schools or maintain our roads or anything else. It simply goes to whoever the creditors of the United States government are and pays them interest for having lent money. Well, let me tell you who they are. They're either large corporations or very rich individuals who have enough money to lend to the government, or foreign companies and foreign individuals and foreign governments that, for other reasons, lend to the United States government. So this government next year is going to be collecting $1 trillion from us and simply transferring it into the hands of the richest entities in the world. That is a redistribution of wealth from the middle and the bottom who pay the taxes to the top who lend to the government. Now, anyone who is nuts understands that's a problem. You know who understands it? The creditors of the United States, because they're looking at what is, if I were to use blunt language, a potential deadbeat here. They're aware that the United States debt is now $38 trillion, that it's costing $1 trillion a year to pay interest. Lord knows how you're ever going to pay it back. And so they worry, these creditors, some of whom have lent the United States government a lot of money. They're worrying, might the day be near when the American people rise up and say, we're not paying taxes to a government that uses $1 trillion and gives it to the rich. We're not doing that. And we will vote out of office any politician who claims otherwise. And you know what happens on the next morning after that? Those politicians inform the creditors that they will no longer be paid. That's called a default. Happens all the time. It happens among businesses. It happens among countries. Argentina has defaulted more than any other country I've ever paid attention to over the years. Could that happen to the United States? Of course. And by the way, that's why the United States credit rating is no longer the best, the AAA that we used to get. We now are only a AA. Are there countries that are AAA? Yes. Are we one of them? No. And you know why? All of this I could expand on for hours. I won't. But for the president to say everything is all a hoax, I just gave you an example of a very serious economic problem. And Mr. Trump could have told us correctly that Democrats have contributed to that problem, which is true, and that Republicans have also, which is true. In fact, he contributed in the first term he had as a president. He made our national debt significantly larger. So no one escapes blame. You can blame them all, but to pretend it's all a hoax, that we have nothing to worry about, I mean, that is misleading the people, which is what you do not want in a president.
To that point, Donald Trump tells us that this affordability conversation is a hoax. But in 2024, Joe Biden kept saying the people just don't understand.
Right.
The economy is really doing well, but people, they just aren't getting the message. So on the one hand, Donald Trump is saying the Democrats are lying to the American people. Joe Biden was saying the American people are stupid.
Right.
Which one? Take a pick.
I used to get angry, and I think I did it more than once, probably in talking to you on your show here. I used to get angry at my fellow economists. You know, I'm thinking of Paul Krugman and others who spoke like that. You know, it's a joke. This is not a failure of communication. The problem is the people in Washington live in one universe, and that universe, with a few exceptions, is very well paid by their employers. And so when they go to the supermarket, they don't really care all that much what the eggs cost or the milk costs or the coffee costs, because, you know, in their budget, it doesn't much matter. Pay a little more, pay a little less. And, you know, if it doesn't matter, you don't pay attention. Mr. Trump does that periodically, talks about some prices and gives out numbers that are so far from reality, you kind of wonder what planet he's living on. He's living on our planet, but he's living a different kind of life. And I would try to explain that during Biden's years. The people aren't stupid. The people live in a different world. You know, affordability is one of those wonderful words. We could say it all simpler, right? On the one hand, we get income. On the other hand, we have to pay the price of the things we want to consume. Affordability is just about the relationship between those two. Do you get an amount of money as income that makes you not care about prices, or do you not? And the majority of Americans live in a world where their income is limited, and so the prices they pay hurt them. And that's what they're complaining about. There is no argument here. Of course, that's right. We all know what has happened to the price of coffee or beef or milk or you name it. And there are very few exceptions. They all go up their own amounts, but up is where they've been going. And that's a very serious problem because the wages and the income haven't kept up. Now, here's a point I would love to make. Who determines the income most of us get? The answer is the employers, the people who hire us to work in a factory or an office or a store. They offer us a certain amount of money. We can bargain a little, but basically the employer determines yay or nay, you're going to get paid X. Now, who determines the prices we have to pay in the store? Well, this may come as a shock, but it's the same employers. That's a prerogative of the employer class. They decide whether to raise or lower or keep the same on their pricing. So the same, by the way, U.S. Census tells us that 3% of Americans are employers. Okay, those 3% have the big influence on the income we get on the one hand and the prices we pay on the other. In other words, those 3% determine affordability. And I think that's what Mr. Trump cannot say, must not say, works real hard never to say. You can blame Democrats, you can blame immigrants, you can blame China, and he does all of that. The one thing you can never do is blame the employer class. And that bingo is the clue that if you're going to blame, that's where the blame belongs.
So, one of the things that Donald Trump loves to point to is the price of gasoline. Right. The cost of gas has fallen. So, for example, I have with the grocery store that I frequent, it's tied to what I purchase is tied to giving me a discount at one of the gas stations. Right. So every 3 or 4 fill-ups, I may save 20 cents a gallon, 18 gallons. It's like $3.60 a fill-up. That's great. But when you look at the weekly expenditures, grocery costs are up 2.7% for the year ending in September. Electricity costs are up more than 5%, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. There are so many other things that are costing so much more money that I spend on a daily basis. Right. It's offsetting this thing. Robert Brown, thank you very much for that $10 super sticker. That those daily expenditures have a much greater impact on my budget than what I pay for or what I might be saving in gasoline right now.
Yes, and and it's a bit of a hustle. You get that discount so that you come back and you shop and you don't feel as bad about the money flowing out of your wallet as you otherwise might do. Look, the American people suffered an enormous inflation in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic. Now, the years 2021 into 2022 were years of very high price inflation, sometimes bouncing around nearly 10% on an annual basis, with some items going faster. What people wanted was those price increases to be unwound, to be offset, to be negated. That never happened. When Mr. Trump says, I have it down to 2.7, yeah, but you have it down to 2.7, which is on top of all of those others that you never canceled. So it's just getting worse and worse and worse. And let me tell you, as a professor, one of the signs I see is we have in many American universities, and I know this firsthand, a collapse in the financial viability of the university and the college. Millions of American young people are deciding not to go to college. It's too expensive, borrowing up the wazoo, so you're saddled with debt for years and years after you graduate. And that at a time when your bachelor's or your master's degree translates into a good job worse than ever or less than ever. So it's not a very valuable degree in that sense. Meanwhile, it's costing you more and more, and the colleges can't pay because they have to pay the price of the coffee and the milk, right, to feed their students. They have to pay all. They can't do it. They can't get the students. The government under Trump is cutting back support for universities of all kinds. You know, they are closing down. They are shrinking. They are laying professors off. I teach, as you pointed out, at the New School University. That's happening there as I'm speaking to you. And I have colleagues who are looking for a job who never expected to do that again for the rest of their lives. And they're going to have a very hard time because everybody's laying off, nobody's hiring in the field. And by the way, just as people, if you think that's smart, let me tell you, in China, they open a new university every month. It's the exact opposite. And we know which is the better signal for how you're going to do in the future. Increasing the education you give your people or cutting it down. Well, we now have Mr. Trump. Isn't that a serious problem? Aren't we going to have to deal with it? Or are you going to tell us that's a hoax too?
So to that point, you during the Biden administration, towards the end of the Biden administration, when there was all this discussion about the United States invading Taiwan, Nancy Pelosi and all these others, they went over to Taiwan and they convinced TSMC, the chip manufacturer, to build a plant in Arizona. Right. And I haven't checked on this for a while, but last I checked, they had to put a stop on that because they couldn't find the workforce, the trained quality workforce that they are going to need to support the manufacturing in the plant.
Right.
So, and we keep hearing example after example after example of Donald Trump talking about our needing to import engineers and software and all kind of other highly skilled individuals, and we don't have them. We're told we don't have them here. How much of that is they're not actually here versus the industries here don't want to pay the going American wage as opposed to importing cheaper waged foreign workers?
It's both, but it's the last one you mentioned that causes the earlier one you mentioned. In other words, it's exactly that they don't want to pay. You know, you can get, I'll pick a country, but it's a real example. You can get a young graduate of medical school who comes from India to work here in the United States for a fraction of what you would have to pay a native-born American who had gone through the American medical school system to do pretty much the same work. And if you look at the curriculum in India, it uses many of the same books with the same logic that the one in the United States works. So that the Indian doctor is very well trained and there's no issue there. They've been working here in the United States, these folks from India, for decades now without any problem at all. But they don't want to pay. And by getting foreigners, they don't want to pay for an education system that trains someone that they don't want to hire at the high pay anyway. So they don't mind not hiring Americans, and they don't want to pay the taxes that could keep American schooling universities in business. Why? Because they would train Americans. Yeah, but they're not hiring the Americans because they cost too much. They're telling the American people, you can, if you want these jobs, you have to learn to live on half of what it is we used to pay for that job. And the Americans are saying, hey, I don't want that. Yeah, okay. And then you're going to get recessions, and you're going to get inflations, and you're going to get a system that is constantly saying to you, you want a job from us here, you got to make it worth our while. Because if you don't, we're either going to go away to those countries where we can pay people a lot less, or we're going to bring them here to pay them a lot less. But the one thing you can count on is we're going to be paying a lot less. You want the job, you have to accept it. If you don't accept it, you won't get the job. It's hard, it's cruel. Nobody has prepared the American people for this, which is why it's experienced by each one of us as a sort of an individual situation. It isn't individual, it's social.
And you mentioned the medical industry. I know on the engineering side, you mentioned India. India has IIT, the Indian Institute of Technology. And from what I understand, that their standard of education is higher than MIT.
Right.
And so Indian students, engineering students, and those on that side of the equation, they take a national test in India. And if they don't test into IIT and have to come to MIT, they find that to be quite a downgrade, quite an insult, quite a failure.
Right.
And
that's a reversal of how things had been for a long time in that part of the world. It's part of what's, the same is now true of China, of India. I believe South Korea is trying to also kind of get to that level. And, it's only a matter of time. Our economy doesn't grow fast enough. Those economies grow faster. It's the way the world is changing. And Mr. Trump, he's just not adequate. He's going to call it all a hoax. I want to remind people, when we first had the really bad news about COVID at the end of 2019 and into 2020, that's what he called that. He didn't want to deal with it, didn't have an idea, didn't want to shake anything up. So it was a hoax, it was a hoax, it was a hoax, until the numbers were so overwhelming, he couldn't do it anymore. And then he tried to convince everybody how he's leading the fight to deal with it. I mean, for all I know, he will figure out some way to come out swinging sometime in the next year. When, by the way, if you want to talk about it, the odds are the inflation is going to get significantly worse. He'll have to come out and claim that he's fighting for affordability, because his argument that it was a hoax was no more effective or successful than calling COVID-19 a hoax.
So, let's talk about your projection on inflation going forward. Why do you see that it's going to get worse, particularly as we keep hearing the Fed and this whole conversation about interest rates and the impact that they are looking in terms of interest rates having on employment and having on inflation?
Okay, the American economy is always bouncing back and forth between what is often called overheating, inflation, or recession, the opposite, when people are out of work and the economy is in the doldrums. If we had time, we ought to devote a session, one of our get-togethers, to talk about what it means to accept an economy that's so unstable. You know, when I teach this in the university, I look across the room to my students and I say to them, here's a way to understand this. If you lived with a roommate as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out long ago. You know, when you go to the refrigerator looking to get that yogurt that you hope to have because it's your lunchtime, and you discover that your roommate made off with your yogurt, an hour earlier, thoughts come to your mind that polite people do not have. Here's the problem. We have an economic crash, a downturn, a recession, on average, every 4 to 7 years. It's the National Bureau of Economic Research, a government research agency that keeps tabs. That's that's why we know it's on average every 4 to 7 years. That's just an average, so sometimes it can take more than 7 and sometimes even less than 4. But 4 to 7 is the average. Okay, when did we have a crash the last time? Answer, the year 2020. We had a real doozy of a downturn, right? Okay, here we are about to go into 2026. There it is, 4 to 7 year average. We're due for one. And people who know this, which are people across the spectrum, this is not about being left-wing, right-wing. Everybody knows what the National Bureau of Economic Research shows. So we all know the Wall Street Journal writes about it. The Financial Times writes about it. We are expecting an economic downturn, and we're likely to get it in 2026. It's due.
Mm-hmm.
But we can already see the statistic you quoted correctly, that we made a mistake in 2025 and undercounted new jobs by a million. That is, we told each other we had 1 million more jobs than in fact were created in that year, helping us to understand why so many people have either no job or a bad job that they want to do better than. Okay, we're ready for it. We see inventories building up. We see companies very hesitant to invest because if you see a recession coming, that's the time you don't want to expand production because you won't be able to sell the stuff you produce, etc.
Mm-hmm.
What Mr. Trump wants, like all presidents, he wants to somehow, if not prevent the downturn, stave it off, postpone it, push it into the future. How do you do that? By making money cheap. Give businessmen cheap money to borrow, lower the interest rate, hope they see, oh, great, now I can get money at only X percent less than I thought I would have to pay. I'm going to borrow. You're hoping. That's all he's doing. He's hoping. But here's, of course, the problem. If you lower interest rates and you stimulate activity, then you now have the other side of the pendulum to worry about, namely the inflation.
Mm-hmm.
Because if people can go to the bank and borrow cheaply, and in other words, get more money into their hands, which is the point and purpose of lowering interest rates, then every business in America knows about it. It's not a secret. The Federal Reserve lowered interest rates last week, and we all heard about it. We all know about it. Every businessman knows there's more money being pumped into the economy by virtue of the lower interest rate. At that point, in a quote-unquote free enterprise system, the employer has a choice to make. How are you going to react to the new money coming into the system because the government has made it cheap to borrow new money that it's printing up? One thing you can do is you can call your supplier and say, more people have money, they're going to be coming into my store, and so I want more stuff to sell to them. You can do that.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the government hopes for. You'll do that because that means the folks you buy from will hire folks, and that'll be good for our economy. But the free enterprise employer has a choice He doesn't have to respond to new money in the economy that way. Here's a second way he can do it. He can jack up the prices because he knows people have more money in their pocket, those who can borrow from banks, which of course not all of us, but the better off amongst us. And so he may do that. It's a lot less risky, it's a lot quicker, a lot easier, and it's more profitable. So guess what? We have learned that if you lower the interest rates, you stimulate employers to raise prices. So here has Mr. Trump all year long been badgering the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates. It doesn't take a genius like me, not that I am one, to say, well, in 2026, we're likely, therefore, to see the price increases that will be starting right after the Christmas holiday because of the availability of cheap money. But there's an entirely second reason, the tariffs, Mr. Trump's tariffs. He has put tariffs at least 15% on every country in the world, and on many countries much higher. Now, those have not yet caused the inflation because he had signaled when he ran for president and in the early months of taking power that he was going to do it. So what every buyer of imported goods did was to stock up on them. In other words, to buy before the tariffs kicked in so they wouldn't have to pay the tariff. So our inventory, our warehouses all across America were bulging. All right, we've used them up. Those were the things to be sold in the autumn and into the Christmas selling season, which is now coming to an end. Starting in the beginning of the year, all of the American providers of imported goods are going to have to restock their shelves, replenish their inventories. But this time, because those tariffs are all in effect, if they are, the Supreme Court may cancel all that. That's also possible. But for the time being, everybody is expecting they're going to have to pay 15% or more higher prices for everything that comes in from overseas. And there's no way on earth that they're going to absorb all of that. Many of them don't make enough profits to survive. So they're not going to go out of business for Mr. Trump. They're going to pass those tariffs on to the rest of us. And we're going to see price increases that could be, they could do damage to Mr. Trump beyond anything he has anticipated. And then he'll be sorry that he got the interest rate lowered because it just piles on even more. Could all that happen? Yes, absolutely.
You mentioned employers raising prices,
right?
But they're not probably going to raise salaries.
No.
And other point for you to respond to, one of the other things that I could see happening here is the lowering of the interest rates, making money cheaper, is not going to have the same effect one would expect it to have because of the lowering of rates of a few years ago, companies are still awash with cash.
Yeah.
So if you could speak to those two things.
Yeah, absolutely. There are many of these additional issues that are going to come to play. You could make a case that lowering the interest rates will not lead to much borrowing. Not at all, because businesses looking around the world right now don't see a justification. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Because of the way Mr. Trump has, how shall I put it, disrespected Canada, our neighbor to the north, and our number one trading partner in the world, Canadians are not buying American goods. They're just not. In many of the western states of Canada, Alberta, those places out there, If you go to a liquor store, you will see in a corner a huge pile of American whiskeys and American alcohol drinks. They sit there in the corner. As the Canadians come in, they ignore them.
Mm-hmm.
And they are not being sold. They're not, therefore, not being replenished. They sit and gather dust. They're not. So an American whiskey company is not going to go borrow money to produce more whiskey if they're selling in Canada, because they're not selling anything in Canada and they have no prospect. That's the other reason why China is so important. China is now a competitor of the United States. And in many parts of the world, they produce goods and services. Let me tell you what the inflation rate of the last 5 years in China was. You ready? Less than 1%. In other words, nothing like the United States. So each year, as our prices went up 2, 3, 4, 5, 6%, the prices of Chinese goods competing with American goods were roughly the same. They didn't have an inflation. Well, that has helped them break into markets all around the world. People are picking up the Chinese goods because they're not going up in price compared to the American goods. All of these things are going to play a role, and Mr. Trump may really have the worst of all possible worlds. And it's going to be so difficult for him to hold on to the notion that all of this is a hoax. If you read the financial press to this time, you'll note also the point you made that many companies have been withholding cash. Why? Because of the uncertainty of Mr. Trump. He promised to bring large numbers of jobs back here, the reshoring of manufacturing. It hasn't happened. There are a few isolated examples, but there is no flooding return. Why not? You would escape the tariff if you produced here rather than overseas. But the CEOs explain why they're not coming here. And they give reasons like the following. We don't know from 1 week to the next whether the tariff is high or low. How the hell are we supposed to make a decision? I'm not going to risk making I'm not going to spend, $2 billion moving my factory from China or India or Brazil to Cincinnati, only to discover at the end of having spent all that money that I could have stayed where I was and made all of that would have been profit for me. And here's another thing they say, which Americans are not being told. If I read in the newspaper, sitting in my breakfast area, wherever I am in the world, and I'm an employer, and I read that in the United States, the government there is sending troops into its major cities over the objection of the political leaders in those cities, that's not a place I want to move. That's a place I thank my lucky stars I'm not in.
That's called instability.
Yes, and it's the kind of instability that really affects what an employer decides. And if there's an inflation coming here, why would it come here? He will have to participate in that inflation. If his workers have to pay more and more, guess what? They're going to press either in their unions, or if they don't have a union, they're going to press for higher wages so they can afford the milk and the coffee and the eggs and all the rest of it. I'm an employer. I don't want to face rising wage demands. So you put together all of the factors, the money they still have that they haven't invested, the anxiety about what's happening here in the United States, seems to be a country falling apart, that has a leader that does things. And by the way, let me give an example that might not occur to you. Over the last 3 or 4 months, this president has given the order for the United States military to kill, if I have the numbers right, about 85 people in boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific. These people are accused by the government of being engaged in the drug traffic. Okay, everybody knows the United States has a drug problem. Everybody knows that those drugs come in. And so, yeah, good. But wait a minute, what's that got to do? For many years, the Navy would board ships that it had some reason to question, inspect them. If they had drugs, confiscate them, arrest whoever's on there, and then give them a lawyer with the rights of evidence to confront the accuser, to have a jury, have a judge. And then the most important point of all, even if when we did that, if we found these individuals guilty, we never kill them. Drug traffic is not a capital crime in the United States. We do not. Instead, our president orders the killing of these people who've had no lawyer, no evidence, no jury, no judge. Mr. Trump goes directly and kills them. You know, Americans may think that, Lord knows I can't account for American public opinion, but I can tell you, because I read European newspapers and foreign newspapers almost every day, this is big news. And the way it's interpreted is you want to think long and hard before you take your factory or your office or your business and go into a country where that kind of thing happens. This is scary business. You don't want, and that, all those things I've just mentioned together, much more persuasive than the up and down of an insecure tariff. So the end result is Mr. Trump has been busy in terms of his economic policy, shooting himself in the foot.
Also, the immigration policy, in that, I want to say it was Samsung that opened a plant in the United States, and then ICE goes in, raids the plant, rounds up the South Koreans, and sends them back to South Korea.
Yeah. You know, that's a level of disorganization and chaos. You can't, you know, you just, even you and I trying to even to be humorous, it's, how do you handle such a screw up?
Right.
The worst conceivable message you would want to sell. Look, that South Korean plant had already spent God knows how many millions of dollars scouting. It was in Georgia, I believe. So they had to find a location. They had to pay people for that. They had to clear there. They had to start building. They had to bring hundreds of workers here to train. All of that money they now regret because it's all out. Who in the world is going to risk having all that happen again? And then you hear that ICE, the statistic I got the other day, 30% of the people detained by ICE have been found to have any legal anything against them.
Correct.
That includes parking tickets and speeding tickets and other nonsense like that. So, you know, that means the vast majority of the people they're detaining are not doing anything that warrants the money, the violence. Everybody knows this around the world. You can't expect it. You know, I'm not a sympathizer for CEOs, but when they explain why they're not coming to the United States, all you can do is nod, of course.
Rampelson says not Samsung, Hyundai. Okay, thank you. Yeah. Thank you for that correction. You know, but to your point, and I want to get to as we wrap this up, I want to get to China's $1 trillion trade surplus before we get out. But just to your point about as we were just talking about immigration, and you know, there's been all this conversation about quote unquote catch and release, that you know we find these almost like they're fish.
Right.
We catch these immigrants what a lot of people don't realize is when I want to say the number's over 90%. When over 90% of undocumented immigrants make their way into the country and get an opportunity to plead their case before a judge, they show up in court.
Yeah.
Over 90%. They don't come here and then run off into the woods. Because they see this as their one life shot.
That's it.
At stability, and they're not going to risk it. So most of them who come here, they're not going to risk being sent back for violating the law, for speeding tickets, for murder. No, they're here on a life improvement mission, and they're not going to abort that mission by doing something stupid that they didn't invest all the time, life risk, and effort and money to get here from El Salvador, only to throw it all away because they're stupid.
That was once explained to me by an FBI agent.
Okay.
It said to me, the statistics have always been that way. Immigrants do less crime than native-born people, and the answer is what you just said, because the risk is too great. You get caught with your hand in the cookie jar, then you can be deported. A citizen can go to jail, but your risk is greater. So correspondingly, they are much more careful not to get on the wrong side of the law, because their whole, as you put it, their whole life chance depends on that.
And the result may be imprisonment, then deportation. So no, they're gonna abide. So final point I wanted to get to, and you mentioned China. I was reading in the Financial Times, China's trade surplus tops $1 trillion for the first time, despite exports sour. I'm sorry. Wilmer, read English, please. Exports soar despite tensions between Washington and Beijing. So the point is, Donald Trump either puts all these tariffs on China or threatens all these tariffs on China. And what does China do? Finds other markets.
That's the key thing. The last few words you just uttered is to be understood. You can't control China. That is no longer available. Thinking that American policy can control China is thinking that if you practice hard enough, you can jump over the Empire State Building. Look, I'm not against practicing. You will do better, but I got news for you. You're not going to jump over the Empire State Building, no matter how much you practice. The United States cannot control China. I know that's hard to imagine, to believe, and to accept. But here was the attempt, and we have it now as an experiment, putting enormous tariffs on China, discouraging everybody from doing business with China. The tariff on the electric cars that they're very good at is 100%. So we don't see any Chinese cars. We don't let them in. We were supposed to be able to affect China by saying, we're going to teach you a lesson. You're not going to be able to sell here. And exports from China to the United States dropped during this year, which isn't even over yet, by 29%. That's incredible in 1 year.
Mm-hmm.
But then the Chinese announced this last week, and that's the number you saw, that their exports hit a record above $1 trillion for the first time. You know what that means? And here's the punchline. It means they were able to more than make up what the United States closed off to them by finding others, probably members of the BRICS alliance that they built, to buy what the United States does, which means the United States' threat to impose tariffs, that's an occasion for laughter over there. And Americans have got to understand this. Otherwise, they will be fooled over and over again by politicians who act like the United States has the big weapons of persuasion that it once had, but it does not have anymore.
Professor Richard Wolff, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis and that clarity, as you always are. And look forward to having you back.
All right. Be my pleasure. Get in touch with me anytime.
Thank you.
And otherwise, have a good Christmas and a good New Year.
Thank you very much. Enjoy the holidays as well. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right. Folks, Professor Richard Wolff, you know, all he does is bring it. That's all. He just brings it. Thank you all for joining me today. Thank you all so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. New episode tomorrow. Professor Dan Kovalik is going to join us tomorrow. We'll be talking about Syria. We'll be talking about this NATO concession from Ukraine. We'll be talking about Venezuela, all of which Professor Kovalik knows about because he has spent a lot of time in Russia. He has spent time in Ukraine. He has spent time in Syria. He has spent time in Venezuela. And we're also going to talk about Colombia because he is lead counsel for Colombian President Petro. So, tell you what, folks, Dan Kovalik tomorrow, you're going to want to be there. Why? Because as a Moon Man would say, it's going to be a big one. Please follow, subscribe, leave a review, share the show. Follow us on social media. All the links are below in the show description. And remember that this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge. Talk without analysis is just chatter. And we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See you all tomorrow. Until then, I am Dr. Wilmer Leon. Have a blessed remainder of your day. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.